The sun had barely begun to stretch its first pale fingers over the jagged ridges of the desert when the Apache warrior stirred. His body, honed by years of endless chases across scorching plains and rugged mountains, ached in the way only a life lived in constant motion could produce. Yet there, at the edge of his vision, a presence that made him pause. Something or someone had appeared beside him during the long, silent night. He blinked against the early light, trying to comprehend the shape sprawled awkwardly against the coarse blanket of sand and sagebrush. It was a young woman, her dark hair tangled with dust, eyes half closed in a sleep that seemed too deep, too unnatural for the world he knew. He had seen the desert give up many things in his lifetime: lost horses, abandoned camps, the remnants of men who had dared to challenge the wind and the sun. He had never seen anything quite like this. A living human, and one so utterly alone, as if the land itself had forgotten her. His instincts, trained to the rhythms of the earth, told him danger lurked nearby. Yet there was something fragile about her, a quiet pulse of life that seemed both impossible and vital. He crouched low, the coarse sand pressing into his palms, every sense straining against the stillness of the dawn. The young woman stirred, eyelids fluttering open, revealing eyes that mirrored the pale morning sky. For a heartbeat, she looked at him not with fear, but with a silent question, as if she had somehow known he would be there. His hand hovered near the small knife at his belt, an old companion shaped by fire and steel, but he did not move. Instead, he studied her face smooth, unmarked by the harshness of the world he knew, and yet carrying a weight that whispered of untold stories. The wind carried a faint scent of sage and earth, mingled with something softer, something unfamiliar. It was rare in a land where survival demanded vigilance, to encounter someone untouched by the cruelty of life. Most faces he saw were carved by hardship, eyes hardened by the same sun that now glinted across the mesas. But hers seemed to hold a secret, a history erased by circumstance, or perhaps by deliberate design. His mind raced. Who had brought her here? Why had she been left alone in this unforgiving stretch of wilderness? Questions crowded him, each one gnawing at the edges of reason. He had learned to trust the desert, but even the most loyal instincts could not unravel this mystery. The warrior reached slowly, almost reverently, to brush the sand from her sleeve. Her body shivered at the contact, waking more fully, a shiver that spoke of cold nights and hunger. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He noted the small scratches along her arm, marks of a struggle long past. She had traveled far, or perhaps she had been brought here by hands she had no reason to trust. 1,000 possibilities spun through his mind, each darker than the last. But he could not turn away. Some force, older than the sun and the wind, anchored him in place beside her, compelling him to stay. Around them, the land stretched wide and empty, a harsh expanse of red earth and jagged rocks. Cacti stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and lean in the first light. Beyond the ridges, the mountains cut into the sky, their peaks hidden in a thin veil of dust and heat. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped, a lonely cry that echoed across the valley. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting as if it, too, recognized the strangeness of this encounter. The young woman's chest rose and fell, the rhythm of life delicate but steady, and the warrior felt a tug in his chest he could not name. He remembered the stories passed down by his elders, tales of spirits wandering the plains, of the land hiding secrets that would reveal themselves only to those patient enough to watch. Maybe she was one of those secrets, or maybe she was flesh and blood, lost to the world and now in his hands.
Ow.
He could not yet tell. His throat tightened with an unfamiliar caution. The desert was merciless, and yet here lay something vulnerable, waiting to be noticed. His gaze drifted to the horizon, half expecting danger to arrive with the sun's full glare. But nothing moved except for the whispering wind through the scrub and the soft rise of her chest. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time in the desert had a way of bending, stretching, and shrinking with the heat and the shadows. The warrior kept his distance, unwilling to disturb the fragile balance of her recovery.
Out.
And yet he could not ignore the pull toward her. It was a careful tension, a quiet dance of curiosity and instinct. He sensed she had a story, one that might explain why the earth had left her here, why the sun had not claimed her before now. Questions pressed against him, unrelenting, but answers remained hidden behind the veil of her silence. Suddenly, a movement in the distance, a flicker of dust rising along a narrow path between the hills made him stiffen. He instinctively reached for his bow, arrow knocked in a practiced motion, eyes scanning the horizon. The desert was a place of watchers, and the watched, a land where a single misstep could mean death. But there was no sound of horses, no shout of men, only the relentless wind and the whisper of sand over stone. The moment passed, but his pulse had quickened, the reminder that the world beyond their small circle was still dangerous, still alive with threat. Turning back to the young woman, he saw her eyes had opened fully now. They held no memory of the place she had been, only the confusion of awakening into something unknown. She reached a trembling hand to her mouth, then let it fall as though she had tried to speak, but found no words. The warrior studied her quietly, understanding that fear did not always need to be voiced. It could live in the eyes, in the tight curl of a fist, in the shallow, uneven breath of someone not yet ready to trust. And he did not rush her. He had learned that survival sometimes demanded patience, and patience sometimes demanded silence. The sun climbed higher, gilding the desert in a harsh, blinding light. The young woman stirred again, and her gaze met his fully this time. There was a flicker of recognition, or perhaps of hope in her expression. Could not yet understand it, and he could not yet know if the world had been cruel or kind to her. But in that moment something shifted between them, fragile and unspoken, like a spark caught in the wind. The desert, endless and indifferent, suddenly seemed smaller, as if it too acknowledged the new presence among the mesas and rocks. The warrior rose, dust falling from his shoulders, muscles taut from years of motion and vigilance. He kept his eyes on the horizon, while one hand hovered near the young woman, ready to protect but unwilling to frighten. Every step, every breath, carried the weight of uncertainty. He did not know who had left her here or why, nor did he know what dangers might still lurk beyond the ridge. But he knew one thing, with a certainty carved by countless dawns: he would not abandon her to the desert. Not today. Not ever. A sudden sound, soft, deliberate, and utterly foreign, echoed from the cliffs above, drawing both their attention. The young woman flinched, and the warrior's heart tightened. Someone was coming, or something. And whatever it was, it carried the power to change the fragile stillness of this morning into chaos. The wind tugged at the dust around them, carrying the scent of smoke, of horses, of life and danger intermingled. The warrior drew himself into a protective stance, muscles coiled, eyes scanning the cliffs and ridges. And the young woman, trembling but alert, leaned slightly closer to him, as if instinct had already decided that he would be her shield. The desert held its breath once more, and in that pause between heartbeats, the Apache warrior understood that the story had only just begun. The young woman, forgotten and left behind by the world, was now his to protect, and the wind whispered of trials and secrets waiting just beyond the horizon. But what force had brought her here, and what price would they both pay for the truth, remained hidden. The warrior tightened his grip on the bow, and she held her ground, eyes wide with cautious trust. And in that still moment, the desert seemed endless, a place of danger, mystery, and unexpected treasure. The horizon trembled with a promise of things to come, and the Apache warrior, heart steady yet wary, knew that their fates were now entwined in a story that neither of them could yet see fully. The silence broke with the soft rustle of footsteps over stone, and suddenly the unknown was no longer distant, it was here. And in that instant, the desert became a crucible for courage, trust, and secrets long buried beneath the sun-scorched earth. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke and distant voices, and both of them froze. What had been a quiet awakening had become a moment poised on the edge of danger. The warrior's hand tightened on the bowstring. The young woman's fingers brushed against his arm instinctively, and somewhere in the distance the desert held its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The story of the young woman and the Apache warrior was beginning. And the first page had been written in silence, dust, and the glimmer of uncertainty that only the old American frontier could hold. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a strange tang, a mixture of smoke and dust that spoke of movement, of life not meant to be in this quiet stretch of desert. The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed, scanning the jagged ridges and the narrow valleys where shadows lay thick and deceptive. The young woman beside him shifted as well, her fingers tightening briefly against the coarse fabric of her clothing, the smallest gesture revealing how little she understood this land and how much she depended on him without knowing it. The desert, he knew, was a patient teacher. It demanded respect, and it punished the careless. Each ridge, each scrubby bush, each rock that jutted like a broken tooth from the earth could conceal a threat or a secret. He had learned this through years of hunting and tracking, of surviving when others would have fallen. Yet even with all that experience, the presence of the young woman complicated everything. Her fragility drew something protective from him he did not fully understand. Her vulnerability was a beacon in a land that rarely offered comfort. He crouched lower, whispering a single word in the old tongue, a greeting that was meant as reassurance and warning at once. The young woman flinched at the sound, but did not move away. The desert, the mesas, and the cliffs seemed to hold their breath with him, and for a moment all that existed was the soft hum of wind over stone, the distant call of a hawk circling the high cliffs, and the fragile rhythm of the young woman's breathing. He allowed himself a careful glance at her, trying to read her features more fully. She was young, perhaps barely into her 17th year, though the hardship of her journey had left her looking older than she likely was. Her clothes were simple, worn, and caked in dust. Her face bore faint scratches, small abrasions that spoke of recent danger. Her eyes, however, were striking dark and wary, yet holding a strange glimmer of intelligence, of life unbroken despite the ordeal she had clearly endured. The warrior's mind wandered briefly to questions he did not dare speak aloud. Who had left her here? Why? Was she a target, or merely a casualty of some larger, hidden struggle? In the desert, nothing was random. Every footprint, every broken branch, every sound carried meaning if one knew how to listen. She somehow had been left in a place where even the most skilled predator or traveler would hesitate to tread. He decided to move, not too quickly, but deliberately, keeping his eyes on the distant ridges. Step by step, he guided her behind the shelter of a low rock formation. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the temperature rose, yet the desert offered little comfort from its harsh glare. He kept his bow ready, arrow nocked, fingers resting lightly on the fletching. The young woman followed cautiously, hesitating at each step, her eyes darting in all directions, as if expecting danger to erupt from the ground itself. "Do you understand me?" he asked in a low voice, careful not to startle her. She nodded uncertainly, and when she spoke, her voice was faint, hoarse from days without water. I don't know where I am." His gaze swept the horizon again, sharp and deliberate. "This is the desert," he said. "It is not kind to those who are lost. You are not safe yet." She shivered, and he realized the chill was not from the morning air, but from fear. Fear could be just as dangerous as the sun or the predators of this land. He adjusted his stance, keeping himself between her and the open plain, as if his body alone could shield her from whatever might emerge from the shadows. As they crouched behind the rocks, his mind began to trace possibilities. She had not come alone, he suspected, but neither had he seen evidence of pursuers close behind. Perhaps she had been abandoned, left to the mercy of the desert. But why? And by whom? His people had taught him to read the traces left on the earth-disturbed sand, bent reeds, the faint drag of a foot over stone, and all of it told a story that had gaps. Someone had been here, he was certain, but the story ended abruptly. The young woman's voice broke the silence again. I remember something. Men, shouting, running. Her eyes were distant, her memories fragmented, like broken pieces of a mirror. He studied her carefully, seeing not just fear, but the trace of survival instinct. The flicker of intelligence assessing her surroundings, piecing together clues she could barely name. Understood that instinct. It was what had kept him alive in battles and hunts when others would have faltered. The wind shifted once more, carrying a sharper scent. This time smoke, yes, but also the faint trace of horses. His grip on the bow tightened. Someone was approaching, and the desert, for all its vastness, would not hide them for long. The young woman stiffened beside him, sensing the change in tension. He did not need to speak. Survival had a language older than words. In those tense moments, he remembered stories of his youth, tales of strangers and lost travelers found in the desert. Some brought to safety, others claimed by the harshness of the land. He thought of the elders' warnings. Never underestimate the cunning of men, and never ignore the silence of the earth. Both could conceal danger, and both could deliver lessons that were not gentle. The sound of hooves came faintly, a soft drumming over the distant rocks. He could not yet tell how many were approaching, only that they were not far. His heart remained steady, trained to the rhythm of danger, but the weight of responsibility pressed upon him. He had found her. That was certain. And now, in this moment of fragile awakening, he must ensure she did not fall victim to whatever forces had left her here. He scanned her again, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched at the edge of her torn sleeve. He wished he could explain the world to her in words she would understand. But the desert did not favor explanations. It favored action, awareness, and readiness. And he would need all three if they were to survive what was coming. The young woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak again, her voice barely audible over the whisper of the wind. "Why me?" He shook his head slowly. "I do not know." The truth was bitter. He did not know, and he could not guess. Some mysteries of the world were meant to reveal themselves in time, but time was a luxury rarely afforded in this land. He moved slightly, keeping his body low, and gestured for her to follow as he edged toward a small depression in the earth, where the rocks offered better concealment. Each movement was deliberate, each step calculated to avoid the sound that might give them away. She followed, eyes wide, trusting him even as she did not understand why. That trust, fragile as it was, anchored him more than the bow in his hands or the arrows at his side. It reminded him that survival was not only about skill, but about connection, about choices that reached beyond the self. From the edge of the ridge, a thin wisp of smoke spiraled into the sky, a signal of life, of movement, of something approaching. The warrior's mind raced. He considered paths, escape routes, the terrain that might give them advantage if they needed to flee. But he also understood that whoever was coming might be skilled, patient, and dangerous. The desert was no stranger to cunning, and he would need every lesson of his life to keep them both safe. He crouched lower, eyes scanning the movement over the rocks, and for a moment he allowed himself a fleeting thought of wonder. This young woman, forgotten by the world, now shared a space in his life that had been occupied only by the wind, the sun, and the earth. Her presence complicated him, distracted him, and yet drew him into a responsibility he could not deny. He realized then that the desert had given him more than an unknown challenge, it had given him a purpose. As unexpected and fragile as the morning light across the mesas, the hooves drew closer and shadows began to stretch across the sand. He signaled for the young woman to stay quiet, pressing a finger to his lips. Her dark eyes met his, wide and uncertain, but she obeyed without hesitation. Silence was their ally now, and in the stillness, he could feel the subtle vibrations of the earth's the approach of life that might bring harm or salvation. Somewhere beyond the ridge, voices whispered, carried faintly by the wind. The words were indistinct, yet sharp enough to suggest urgency, intent, and perhaps danger. The warrior's muscles coiled, his mind cataloging every sound, every shadow, every movement. He knew the desert's lessons well. The first sign of disturbance could mean everything, and hesitation could be fatal. As the young woman pressed closer, instinctively seeking the protection he offered without words, he felt a mixture of resolve and unease. The desert had given him a companion, fragile and bewildered, and now it would test them both. Whatever lay beyond the ridge would reveal itself soon, and when it did, they would need courage, skill, and a bond neither had yet fully recognized. The sun climbed higher, the heat beginning to bake the desert sands, and the hooves drew nearer. The voices, though still distant, had grown clearer, carrying a note of determination, of purpose. The warrior's eyes swept the horizon one final time, and for the first time since sunrise, a shadow of uncertainty touched him. Whoever approached, they were not ordinary travelers. The desert had brought them to this moment for a reason, and the truth of it, hidden in the folds of the land and the hearts of men, remained unknown. He crouched beside the young woman, ready to move at the first sign of threat. The wind carried the scent of horses, dust, and the faint trace of gunpowder, a warning that the calm of dawn was ending. He glanced at her, and though she was trembling, he could see in her eyes a spark of determination, a survival instinct awakening alongside his own. Together they waited, the tension stretching taut between them, the desert holding its breath, the horizon promising trials that neither could yet imagine. The moment was poised on the knife's edge, and the Apache warrior understood that the next minutes would shape not only their fate, but the course of a story that had begun in silence, mystery, and the fragile glow of human connection. He drew a slow breath, the desert air thick with anticipation, felt the first stirrings of movement beyond the ridge. The sound of hooves drew closer, thundering faintly over the rocks and dry scrub, and the Apache warrior tightened his grip on the bow. The young woman beside him pressed close, every instinct in her body urging her to flee, though the desert offered no clear refuge. He could see the faint glimmer of sunlight off metal, the edges of something sharp, guns, perhaps, or tools meant for tracking, weapons that spelled danger. His mind raced, calculating every movement, every possibility. They were not far from the ridge, and he knew that whoever approached would have the advantage of sight first, speed second, and perhaps a plan that had been set in motion long before he had found her. The young woman's hand brushed his arm, tentative and fearful. He did not flinch, though his muscles coiled like springs beneath the weight of the moment. She looked at him, silently asking the questions he could not answer aloud. Who are they? Why are they here? What will happen if they find us? The desert offered no guidance, no mercy. All he could do was watch and wait, each heartbeat counting like a drum in the stillness. From the ridge came movement. Shadows shifted in ways that suggested more than one person, careful, deliberate. He could see horses now, their riders cloaked against the sun, faces partially hidden. Their purpose was clear. They were hunters, or worse, men with intent to claim, capture, or destroy. The Apache warrior crouched lower, motioning for the young woman to stay quiet, to stay still. Every instinct screamed that sound could betray them, that a single misstep might bring the world crashing down. Yet even in the tension, he allowed himself a fleeting glance at the young woman. Her eyes, wide and alert, held more than fear. They held the beginnings of courage. A glimmer that this ordeal was not merely something to survive, but something to endure together. He had seen that look before, in children and young travelers who had faced the desert alone. Survival demanded more than skill, demanded the will to act when all else urged retreat. The riders paused atop a ridge farther out, surveying the valley below. Their voices were low, words indistinct, but the urgency in their tone reached him even across the distance. He shifted imperceptibly, sliding behind a jut of rock that offered better cover, pulling the young woman with him. She flinched but obeyed, her trust growing silently as she followed his every movement. The desert, he knew, rewarded attentiveness and punished hesitation. In this moment, perched on the edge of danger, demanded both in equal measure. As he observed the riders, fragments of a larger picture formed in his mind. Their horses were healthy, their gear maintained. This was no casual search. It was deliberate, organized, and dangerous. Perhaps they sought the young woman specifically, though he could not be certain. Perhaps she was part of some larger plan, a pawn in schemes that had nothing to do with the desert, but everything to do with the intentions of men beyond its reach. He considered his options. Flight was possible, but risky. The ridges offered concealment only if one knew their way, and the desert held more traps than open space. Fight was possible, but uncertain. The men were likely armed, perhaps more than he could face alone. And yet neither flight nor confrontation could be taken without the knowledge that the young woman was here, fragile and untested by the harshness of this land. To act recklessly would place her life in danger. The young woman stirred slightly, and he caught the movement in his peripheral vision. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The desert had stripped her of comfort, of certainty, and now of speech. Her fear was palpable, yet he sensed determination beneath it. She had survived to this point. She had endured abandonment and isolation. The spark of that resilience gave him a measure of hope, even as the danger grew more immediate. He remembered the lessons of his elders. Always read the wind, watch the earth, and understand that not all threats came from the visible world. Sometimes the unseen was the most deadly, and sometimes patience was the only weapon that could tip the balance. He glanced down at her, realizing that even without words, she had begun to learn, to trust the instincts that had kept him alive for years. Her presence, once a mystery, was now a shared reality to lives intertwined in the crucible of the desert. Yet questions remained unanswered. Why had she been left here? What had driven the riders to this particular ridge, and what would they do when they discovered them? The warrior allowed himself to track the riders from a new angle, scanning the rocks for vantage points, calculating the paths they might take. The sun glinted off the metal of their weapons, and he realized that the men were prepared for a hunt, experienced in their purpose. Every detail mattered: the angle of the ridge, the shadows cast by the morning sun, the direction of the wind. The desert could conceal, but it could also betray. One wrong movement could reveal them, and he was determined that this would not happen. Meanwhile, the young woman's eyes flitted over the landscape. Noting subtle cues, she did not yet name shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. A ridge that offered better concealment, a break in the wind that could carry sound farther than expected. Her instincts, though raw, began to complement his, creating a fragile but growing alliance between them. He recognized the value in this, knowing that survival in the desert was rarely a solo endeavor, especially when faced with calculated threats. He allowed himself a moment to think about the life she must have had before this place, before the desert claimed her attention and forced her into this precarious situation. She had clearly known hardship, though not the kind the desert inflicted on its long-term dwellers. Perhaps she had been a traveler, perhaps something more. Her fear, though present, carried the weight of someone who had survived other dangers. That realization strengthened his resolve. She was not simply a fragile charge. She was a person with instincts, resourcefulness, and a will to endure. The riders began to move, cautiously descending into the valley, their attention fixed on the terrain below. The warrior could see the subtle tension in their posture, the practiced movements of men accustomed to tracking and confrontation. He pressed the young woman closer, signaling for absolute stillness. Even a whisper could carry across the sand, could alert them to this hidden refuge. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing him into action, the awareness that any mistake could shatter the delicate balance of this moment. In the quiet between the movements of the riders, he allowed himself a fleeting reflection on the life of the desert itself. The sun, relentless and bright, cast long shadows that moved with the earth's subtle rotation. The wind whispered secrets through the scrub, bending the tall grasses and carrying the scent of sage, dust, and distant water. The land was alive with hidden currents of danger and opportunity, and he knew that understanding them was key to survival. The young woman, though untrained, seemed to sense some of these rhythms as well, and he acknowledged that her presence, unexpected and fragile, had begun to teach him patience in new ways. Yet the approach of the riders was not the only complication. The desert held other dangers, unseen but present. Predators might roam, natural traps lay hidden beneath the shifting sand, and the harshness of sun and heat could sap strength in ways far more insidious than any weapon. He watched the young woman's breathing, noted the subtle tremor in her hands, and knew that every moment of delay increased the risk. The desert demanded attention to countless details, and he had learned that experience alone was sometimes insufficient. Awareness, strategy, and quick adaptation were the true keys to survival. The riders halted again, forming a loose semicircle as they scanned the valley. One of them spoke, words carried faintly by the wind, suggesting command or warning. The warriors' senses sharpened. They were organized, experienced, and deliberate. Whoever they were, they had come prepared to hunt or capture, and perhaps neither would end well for the young woman if he failed to act. He scanned for escape routes, considering the narrow passes, the shadowed cliffs, and the hidden folds of terrain that might give them an advantage. He felt the weight of history pressing against him, the lessons of his people, the trials of the desert, and the harsh wisdom passed down through generations. Survival was never certain. Yet here in this moment, he recognized a rare opportunity to protect, to teach, and to forge a bond with someone who had known abandonment and fear, yet was learning to trust in the strength of another. It was a delicate balance, poised on the knife's edge of action and inaction, and one misstep could unravel everything. The young woman leaned slightly closer, her trust evident even as fear lingered. He acknowledged the gesture with a small nod, silent affirmation that he would not leave her behind. The riders shifted again, closer now, moving as if sensing something hidden in the rocks, unaware of the two lives concealed just beyond their vision. The desert seemed to tighten around them, every gust of wind, every shifting shadow amplifying the tension. The Apache warrior drew a slow breath, heart steady, but mind racing. The moment demanded patience, vigilance, and the readiness to act. He had learned that in the desert, survival often hinged on the unseen, on the quiet decisions made in shadows and silence. And now, with the young woman beside him, their fates intertwined. He knew that the challenges ahead would test every lesson he had learned and every instinct he possessed. The riders' voices carried a hint of frustration now, their attention scanning the terrain, yet still failing to notice the hidden pair. The desert held its silence, but the tension was palpable. A thin line stretched taut between life and peril. The young woman's eyes met his once more, wide and questioning, yet holding the beginnings of resolve. They waited together, hearts synchronized to the rhythm of anticipation, knowing that the next movement could change everything. The horizon shifted, dust rising in small plumes, and the rider at the front tilted slightly, catching a glint of something unusual in the rock formation. The warrior's muscles tightened, fingers brushing the fletching of his arrow. He could not yet strike, could not yet reveal their presence. Timing, precision, and patience were paramount. The desert had taught him that much, and now it would teach him more, as the riders moved ever closer, unaware of the lives hidden in plain sight. The desert sun beat down relentlessly now, washing the cliffs and mesas in harsh, golden light that made shadows deep and deceptive. The Apache warrior crouched lower behind the jagged rock, arrow notched and bowstring taut, every muscle coiled in readiness. The young woman huddled beside him, her body tense but obedient, eyes darting over the terrain as though trying to read the same invisible signs that had guided him for years. The riders had drawn closer, their horses' hooves stirring small clouds of dust that glimmered in the sunlight, their voices now sharp and commanding. The warrior allowed himself a measured breath, listening carefully to the cadence of hooves and the soft murmurs of commands. They were close enough now that any wrong move could give away their position. He glanced at the young woman, noting how her hand hovered near his arm, instinctively seeking reassurance. She did not speak. Words would only risk revealing them. He admired her silence, the way she had absorbed lessons without instruction, trusting instinct over instruction. It was a rare kind of courage, born not from experience but from necessity. From the ridge a shadow shifted. The warrior tensed, aware that the riders were scanning the terrain, trying to anticipate any hidden presence. One of them tilted slightly, catching the glint of sun off the rock. Time slowed. Every heartbeat echoed in the still air. Every movement carried the weight of consequence. He could feel the desert itself holding its breath, waiting to see which side would act first. The young woman's dark eyes met his, wide and questioning, and he offered a slight nod, a silent promise that he would protect her, no matter the cost. The riders' voices grew sharper, tinged with suspicion. They were no longer merely searching, they were strategizing, moving as if the land itself were a board of careful calculations. The warrior's mind raced, mapping out the terrain, calculating paths of retreat, and imagining every possible scenario. He considered the cliffs above, the narrow passage between rocks below, the uneven ground that might betray a sudden movement. The desert offered no mercy for hesitation, no forgiveness for error. A faint clatter drew his attention to the rocks near their concealment. The young woman flinched, and he pressed a hand gently against her shoulder, urging stillness. The clatter repeated, a small pebble rolling over the sand, stirred perhaps by a careless breeze or by some hidden creature. But in this moment, even the smallest sound could mean disaster. The warrior's senses sharpened, ears straining, eyes scanning for any motion that might give them away. The riders began to shift positions, spreading into a loose line, eyes trained on the valley below. Their formation suggested discipline, preparation, and intent. Whoever they were, they did not wander blindly. They sought something or someone with purpose. The warrior recognized the danger, one misstep. One glance in the wrong direction, and their fragile concealment would vanish. The desert could protect, but only temporarily, and the moment of exposure would be swift and brutal. The young woman's breathing was shallow but steady. He felt the tension radiate from her, and he allowed himself the smallest flicker of empathy. She had been abandoned, left to the mercy of a harsh world, and now she faced another trial of unknown magnitude. Her presence, once a mystery, had become his responsibility. and that responsibility pressed on him like the weight of the sun above. He shifted slightly, adjusting their position behind a jagged rock formation that offered slightly better cover. The riders had slowed, scanning for any sign of movement, their posture tense as though anticipating resistance. One of them, a figure taller and broader than the others, raised a hand, pointing toward a section of rocks. The warrior's heart beat faster. The moment of confrontation was approaching, inevitable and dangerous. The young woman leaned slightly closer, instinctively, as if sensing that their fate depended on the decisions he made next. He did not speak. Words could betray them. Instead, he scanned the surrounding landscape, mapping escape routes, hidden alcoves, and the uneven ground that might work to their advantage. Every shadow could conceal, every ridge could betray. Your desert demanded awareness and patience, but the pressure of the approaching riders made patience almost unbearable. Dust rose in faint spirals from the valley below as the riders began to fan out, spreading methodically across the open ground. They were closer now, the glint of metal from weapons catching the sun in small, sharp flashes. The warrior tightened his grip on the bow, arrow ready, and he could feel the young woman's pulse quicken beside him. Her hand brushed against his arm once more, a silent acknowledgement that she trusted him, that she understood the stakes even without fully grasping the danger. The largest rider dismounted, moving with careful steps, eyes scanning the ground as though reading invisible clues. He was skilled, experienced, deliberate. The warrior recognized the signs immediately, the careful placement of feet, the scanning motion, the tilt of the head that suggested a predator's precision. The desert had taught him to read such signs, and he knew that even a single misstep could alert this man to their presence. A sharp gust of wind shifted the loose sand, rolling tiny particles across the surface and whispering through the rocks. The young woman flinched, but he pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Even a sigh could carry across the valley and betray their location. The air seemed charged with anticipation, each moment stretched taut, as if the desert itself had woven a web of tension around them. He traced the line of the riders with his eyes, noting the pattern of their movement, the slight gaps that could offer a momentary advantage. Escape might be possible, but it would require split-second timing, absolute coordination, and a steady heart. And yet retreat alone was not enough. These men were organized, relentless, and their purpose remained unknown. The stakes were higher than survival. The young woman's life hung precariously in the balance. A sudden sound, a twig snapping, almost imperceptible, made both of them freeze. The rider's head shifted instinctively, scanning the direction of the sound. The warrior's muscles tensed, arrow ready, eyes locking on the spot where danger might emerge. The young woman pressed closer, instinctively mirroring his readiness. For a heartbeat, the desert was suspended in silence, the tension palpable, each second stretching into eternity. One of the riders, the largest, moved toward the source of the sound, stepping carefully over the uneven rocks. The warrior's breath slowed, his focus absolute. The young woman's hand trembled against his arm, and he gave the slightest squeeze, a reassurance that their silent alliance remained unbroken. The desert around them seemed to shrink, funneling attention, danger, and anticipation into the narrow space they now occupied. The riders fanned out further, voices hushed but urgent. We're closing in, methodical, relentless. The warrior's mind raced through possibilities, strategies, and contingencies. He considered escape, concealment, misdirection, but each choice carried risk. Every movement required precision, every breath might reveal them. The desert's lessons were clear. Survival was as much about reading intent as about force, and the wrong assumption could be fatal. The young woman's eyes darted toward him, silent questions mirrored in her gaze. He shook his head slightly, warning her not to act, not to speak, not to move. Trust was fragile, and in this moment, it was all they had. The riders were now close enough to see the faint outlines of the rocks, the shadows of concealment. The warrior felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The moment of exposure was near. The desert itself seemed to amplify the tension, the heat making the air shimmer and distort, creating illusions of movement and depth. Dust and wind whispered around them, carrying scents of sage and sweat, horses and leather, danger and uncertainty. The warrior's senses, honed over years of survival, absorbed every detail. The young woman, though inexperienced, mirrored his attention, and he realized that she was learning in the harshest of classrooms, the desert and its threats. The riders paused again, voices low, movements deliberate, scanning the rocks where they were hidden. The largest rider stepped forward, tilting his head as though reading an invisible map etched into the earth itself. The warrior's heart pounded, muscles coiled, senses sharpened. Every instinct screamed that the moment of confrontation was imminent, that the tension could snap at any second, sending them both into a dangerous, uncontrolled struggle. The young woman's hand brushed his arm once more, and he acknowledged the gesture with a slight nod. They were ready, poised on the edge of uncertainty, bound together by fear, instinct, and necessity. The riders' formation shifted slightly, encroaching on their concealment, and the warrior knew that any false move would expose them fully. The desert, patient and indifferent, had guided them to this moment, a crucible of suspense, a stage for the inevitable clash between hidden strength and calculated intent. A sharp glint of metal caught his eye. One of the riders had spotted something. The largest rider moved toward it, voice raised briefly in warning. The young woman tensed beside him, and he pressed her closer, heart steady, bow ready. The desert seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Every rock, every shadow, every breath, part of the tension building to a breaking point. Time slowed. The wind carried dust and the scent of sweat and horses. The riders were almost upon them, eyes scanning every crevice, every shadow, every possibility. The young woman's fingers clenched around his arm, and he gave a subtle squeeze, a silent signal that they were ready. The desert had brought them here, and now it demanded reckoning. Every heartbeat, every breath, every muscle was focused, prepared, aware. The moment of confrontation was near. The riders had closed the distance, shadows stretching across the valley. The warrior drew the bowstring taut, arrow aimed, eyes locked on the largest rider, who moved with deliberate caution. The young woman pressed close, silent, trembling, yet poised with a trust born of necessity. The desert held its breath. The wind whispered. Apache dust swirled across the sunlit rocks. And in that charged silence, every instinct, every lesson, every unspoken understanding came together as the warrior prepared to face the unknown. The climax was approaching, but the resolution remained just beyond reach. Poised on the edge of danger, suspense, and the raw unpredictability of the desert itself, the desert seemed to hold its breath as the largest rider froze. Sensing the presence hidden among the rocks, the Apache warrior's muscles coiled like springs, bowstring taut, arrow aimed with precision. Time itself stretched, the wind whispering across the sand, carrying dust and faint scents of sage and sweat. He could feel the pulse of the young woman beside him, her fingers clinging lightly to his arm. The tension between them mirrored in every muscle, every breath. The riders were close now, dangerously so, but hesitation or panic could spell their doom. The warrior shifted slightly, careful to stay hidden, drawing the young woman's attention to the faint gap between two boulders, a potential path of retreat. Her eyes widened as she understood the silent suggestion, and she nodded ever so slightly, trusting him completely in the moment of uncertainty. The riders moved cautiously, stepping over rocks and scanning every crevice, unaware of how close they were to their quarry. The largest rider's hand hovered near the weapon at his belt, ready for action, while his companions fanned out to cover more ground. Then, a sudden movement, a flicker of dust, disturbed by the smallest rock, underfoot gave the warrior the moment he had been waiting for. With a swift, controlled motion, he released the arrow. It flew silent and true, embedding itself in the ground near the largest rider, startling him and forcing a split-second pause. That tiny window was enough. He grabbed the young woman's hand, pulling her through the narrow opening between the boulders, using their concealment to their advantage. The riders shouted, voices echoing across the valley, but the desert swallowed much of the sound, and the pair moved quickly, low and silent. As they reached a small depression, shielded by rocks and scrub, the warrior allowed himself a brief glance at the young woman. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but relief shone in her eyes, mingled with awe. He nodded, acknowledging her courage without words. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had forced them into a bond neither had anticipated, and the shared experience had begun to forge trust that ran deeper than language could convey. The riders regrouped, frustrated, their shouts carrying across the valley as they tried to track the pair through the uneven terrain. The warrior observed them, noting the pattern of movement, the slight overconfidence that came from assuming the land was under their control. It did not understand the desert, its hidden trails, its deceptive shadows, or the knowledge born from years of survival in its relentless heat. That understanding was their advantage, and he intended to use it fully. The young woman's voice broke the silence softly. Who were they? He shook his head slightly. Men who would do harm. We do not need their names. His gaze returned to the ridge above, watching the shadows, the movement, the threat that was still very real. She nodded, absorbing his words, and a sense of resolve began to settle over her fear. She had survived abandonment, isolation, and now she was learning the rhythms of the desert, the ways of survival alongside someone who understood its language. As they moved cautiously through the rocks, the warrior began to piece together what little he could of her story. She had been traveling, or perhaps fleeing, when she was left behind. Her clothes, worn and dusty, told of long days on the trail, of nights without fire or protection. Her eyes reflected a history of endurance, of moments lived where trust was a luxury she could not afford. And yet, despite it all, she had made it to him, a living testament to her will to survive. They paused near a small creek, hidden by brush, and the warrior knelt, gesturing for her to drink from the shallow water. She hesitated, then cupped her hands, drinking slowly, her body beginning to relax for the first time in days. He watched her, knowing that the desert did not forgive carelessness. Each sip was measured, each movement cautious, a reflection of the lessons she was already beginning to learn. The riders had not given up. The shouts and distant movements reminded them both that danger was never far behind, and the warrior remained alert, eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. But the young woman, despite her exhaustion, began to move with greater confidence, following his lead as they navigated the rocks and scrub. Her growing awareness of the desert's rhythms, its hidden paths, and subtle signs of life gave him a measure of hope that they could remain ahead of danger long enough to find safety. As the sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down on the valley, the warrior realized that their journey was far from over. The desert had tested them, forcing them to confront fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. But it had also revealed courage, resilience, and a bond forged under pressure. The young woman had become more than a survivor. She had become a partner, learning from him, adapting to the land, and discovering a strength she had not known she possessed. They found a sheltered alcove, a natural formation of rock that offered shade and a vantage point over the valley below. The warrior allowed a rare moment of rest, sitting with the young woman beside him. She leaned back against the cool stone, exhausted but alert, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and lingering tension. He glanced at her, offering a small, approving nod. "You have done well," he said softly. "The desert does not forgive mistakes easily." She smiled faintly, a gesture fragile but genuine. "I would not have made it without you," she whispered. He shook his head. We survived together. The words were simple, yet carried weight, a reflection of the bond that had formed in the crucible of danger. It was a truth the desert had taught him over years of hardship, and now he saw it mirrored in her eyes. Trust, courage, and the will to endure were more powerful than any weapon, more reliable than any path through the rocks and scrub. From their vantage point, they watched the riders below. Frustration was evident in their movements, and the warrior allowed himself a measured sense of satisfaction. The desert, once again, had been an ally. It had concealed them, guided them, and amplified their advantage. The young woman, leaning slightly closer to him, seemed to understand this instinctively. Together, they had turned fear into survival, uncertainty into vigilance, and danger into a lesson neither would forget. The warrior traced the horizon, considering the next steps. The young woman's journey, though interrupted and perilous, would continue beyond this valley. She had been forgotten once, left behind by forces she did not understand. But now she had a chance to reclaim her path, strengthened by endurance, guided by instinct, and protected by someone who understood the land. The desert had revealed more than danger. It had revealed potential, resilience, and the quiet power of connection. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocks. The warrior and the young woman moved carefully down the valley. Each step was deliberate, measured, and quiet. The riders, frustrated and unable to locate them, began to retreat toward the distant ridges, their voices fading with the wind. The danger was not entirely gone, but it had been delayed, and that delay was enough for now. The young woman paused, turning to look at the warrior. "Will they come back?" she asked softly, fear lingering in her voice. He shook his head slowly. "Perhaps, but we will be ready. The desert has taught us how to survive, how to move, and how to endure. It is not kind, but it is fair." She nodded, absorbing the lesson, her gaze sweeping the valley as if seeing it with new eyes. The desert no longer appeared endless and empty. It held paths, hiding places, and lessons carved into the rocks and sand. She began to understand in her own way that survival was not only about avoiding danger, but about learning, observing, and trusting both instinct and the guidance of those who had mastered the land. They continued their descent, moving with the rhythm of the desert, shadows lengthening as the afternoon lights softened. The warrior remained vigilant, yet he allowed himself moments to observe her resilience, her growing awareness, and the strength she had shown under pressure. He realized that their journey, though far from over, had changed them both. The young woman had discovered courage in the face of abandonment and fear, and he had discovered the quiet satisfaction of teaching, guiding, and protecting another life. As they reached a narrow stream that cut through the valley, the warrior gestured for her to drink and rest. The water was cool and clear, a rare gift in the harsh desert, and she drank deeply. Her exhaustion, evident but tempered by the relief of safety. He watched her carefully, noting each movement, each small gesture, as a measure of her endurance and adaptability. The desert had tested them, but it had also offered moments of grace and reprieve, subtle yet meaningful. The sun dipped lower, casting the valley in a warm, amber glow. The warrior allowed a rare smile, acknowledging the triumph in surviving another day. Navigating the dangers of the desert and protecting the young woman who had become more than a stranger, she had become a companion. A testament to resilience and a living reminder of the lessons the land could teach. As night fell, they set up a small, concealed camp near the stream. The young woman tended to minor injuries, the warrior keeping watch, ever alert to the faintest movement or sound. The desert night was alive with whispers, coyote calls, the rustling of small creatures, the wind shifting across the rocks. Yet for the first time since she had appeared at his side, the young woman allowed herself a moment of calm. The desert, harsh and relentless, had given them both a measure of clarity, trust, and connection forged in the fire of survival. The warrior looked at her once more, noticing the subtle strength she now carried, the awareness sharpened by danger, and the quiet courage that had carried her through the day. "You are stronger than you realize," he said softly. She smiled faintly, a mix of gratitude and understanding. "And you have taught me to survive." He nodded. "The desert has taught us both." The stars emerged above, distant and brilliant, as if witnessing the journey that had begun with fear, uncertainty, and abandonment. The young woman had been a forgotten treasure, left to the mercy of the land, yet through endurance trust. And the guidance of the Apache warrior, she had reclaimed her place in the world. The desert remained vast, full of challenges yet to come, but for this night they had survived. As they sat together in the quiet of the valley, the warrior knew the journey ahead would continue. But the lessons of this day, the resilience of the young woman, the power of trust, and the quiet strength born of survival, would remain with them always. The desert, indifferent yet instructive, had shaped their fates, and in its harsh beauty, they had discovered courage, connection, and the fragile yet unbreakable thread of life. And in that moment, as the wind whispered through the rocks and the stars shone brightly overhead, the Apache warrior and the young woman understood that their paths had intertwined for a reason, and that together they could face whatever the endless desert might yet hold. Their story had begun with uncertainty, danger, and the unknown, but it ended for now with survival, trust, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. Carried forward by the lessons of the land and the strength they had found in one another,